Welcome back to the second half of the second day of the Big Shift, the 2021 National Shared Mobility Summit. I'm Benji de la Peña. I'm the CEO of the Shared Use Mobility Center. I hope you dropped into the expo or tried some awkward online networking. In-person networking is awkward enough. We tried to make it even more awkward by making it virtual. So the summit is virtual and distributed. We're so glad to have you today and look forward to seeing you again next Tuesday and the Tuesday after that. And don't miss our Thursday Echo sessions featuring our Mobility Justice Spotlight. For the benefit of our visually impaired participants, let me describe how I appear on screen. I'm a middle-aged Asian man with brown skin and short black hair. I'm wearing black rimmed glasses and a white shirt. Our host for our second key conversation today is Danielle J. Harris from Elemental Accelerator. I won't spend much time introducing the panelists. Their bios are available on the event website if you need it. So let me not take up any more time and pass you over to our host, Danielle.
All right. Thank you so much, Benji. Yes, my name is Danielle J. Harris. I'm wearing a yellow shirt and Ali Wong glasses, and I washed my hair for you all, so it's a little wet. I hope you guys can smell the freshness. Anyways, so excited to join you all today. Today is my debut as a SUMC board member, and I was so excited that Benji gave me this opportunity of kind of a clean slate of whatever I wanted to share with you guys. And I've been at Elemental Accelerator for about 2 years now. And I have just been so enamored by the investor community. And as a city planner, I know that I would have never gotten to have this experience if I had never gone to Elemental. But really, it was the fact that I got to understand so much about the way that mobility companies operate and move. And similar to cities, you know, we're beholden to our constituents and to the grantees, the regional bodies, state governments, and federal government when we receive funding and we have to do reporting. It's very similar for mobility companies with their investors. So I brought on some of great friends that I've met along my journey at Elemental. If you guys could turn on your cameras, we're going to jump right into introductions, and I'm hoping that we can have a very lively conversation to kind of share the whole range of investors that are really out there, as investors are not a monolith. So I'm hoping that Chaarvi can start and tell us why you chose investing as your tool for change, and if you could tell us about AmFam and what their goal is.
Yeah, thanks, Danielle. So happy to be here. And hi, everyone. I am a Asian Indian woman with black long hair, wearing a gray shirt, and I have white glasses, Warby Parker. And yeah, excited to be here. I am an associate with the American Family Insurance Institute for Corporate and Social Impact, and that's a mouthful, and we never use that long name. We go by AmFam Institute for short, and we invest in early stage seed and Series A companies that have a social impact. So I have been working as an investor in India, Vietnam, and now here in the US. And for me, I'm really excited by investing in amazing new companies and startups, because I think that they have so much potential, especially with all the new innovations that are coming out. I think it's exciting to see what's out there and how people are finding new ways to create impact and change with whatever resources they have.
All right, fabulous. Can we go Nneka, Greg, and then Christian, and then we'll jump into the discussion.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nneka Uzoh, and I'm a senior vice president at Aligned Climate Capital. And why I chose investing as my tool for change is that in the capitalistic society that we live in, who controls the capital or the money essentially has the power. So I decided that I want to be in a place where we can help, decide how capital is deployed and ensuring that it's deployed in the most equitable way. And since I've chosen this field of sustainability as my focus, ensuring that the investments we make really improve the livelihood and quality of living for everyone on this planet. At Aligned Climate Capital, we invest across lots of sectors, including clean transportation, energy, resilient infrastructure, and sustainable land use.
Am I up next? Sorry. I'm Greg. I'm a vaguely ethnic looking gentleman with long hair that's pulled back in a ponytail, and I'm wearing a gray jacket over a gray shirt with a dog on it. I'm a principal at Kapor Capital. Kapor Capital is an early stage venture capital fund that invests in companies that are closing gaps of access, opportunity, or outcome in low-income communities or communities of color in the United States. Why I do this, I think that there's kind of two ways to have enduring solutions. One is through collective action, which is typically either people powered or government powered. It's very slow typically, but also very important. And the other is through private capital that's well structured and targeted to solve problems that actually affect all of us. Mobility is definitely something that, whether or not the billionaire class wants to admit it, is a civic good that we all participate in. And so therefore we should have solutions, whether they are public side or private side, that actually help everybody get to where they need to be in a way that doesn't, poison the atmosphere to a level that would make life much harder on the planet. So that's why I do this.
Hi everyone, Christian Okoye. I'm a partner at Sidewalk Infrastructure Partners. I am a black man in her 30s with a green sweater on, black hair. I joined Sidewalk Infrastructure about 3 months ago. We are an infrastructure investor that's really kind of looking for the nexus of innovation and infrastructure. We spun out of Alphabet a couple of years ago and really kind of put their focus on bringing innovation to the physical world. Wanted to see what we can do to bring more of that mindset to the infrastructure space and accelerate innovation there. So it's really been fascinating. We've looked at a number of things from broadband digital infrastructure to circular economy, autonomous vehicle infrastructure, which I could speak a little bit about, but I've largely been more of an energy guy and focusing on the energy transition and how to think about proliferation of DERs and kind of what's going on in the virtual microgrid, virtual power plant space. I spent most of my career largely in the energy side, energy finance, and building infrastructure, emerging markets, and then moved on to clean tech investing for a few years. And for me, it's always been, in terms of why I do this, it's always been kind of a great use of my skill sets I found, and just a great way that I kind of see the world, but also thinking about some of the challenges in the capital flows and how do we get it to what a lot of people here spoke about, to get a more equitable distribution, but also moving and accelerating the pace towards that energy transition. I do think that there's a number of inefficiencies in the way risk is perceived sometimes, especially from large capital providers. And so I've always been interested in kind of plugging myself in, kind of that nexus of the innovation and the large capital deployment side, and trying to accelerate those trillions of dollars that are usually kind of going into more traditional sources.
All right, great. And just a little bit about Elemental Accelerator. We are a commercial catalyst. And so what we do is we support climate technologies focused in energy, mobility, water, agriculture, and the circular economy by providing grant funding for demonstration projects as well as coaching. And yeah, I gotta say, it's been an exciting ride at Elemental this past 2 years. And I really do enjoy the investing side. Is one, I have such great company, but also I really do see a gap in the capital that is given to diverse founders, and wanting to shore that up, as well as just understanding, government has done it the same way for quite some time, and we're, approaching innovation, doing more and more innovation, but I do see entrepreneurs moving at the speed that's necessary to address climate change. All right, so let's jump into the questions. I thought it would be exciting for you guys to share any notable mobility companies that you have talked to, invested in, and share some of the challenges that you've witnessed for mobility startups. So if anyone wants to jump in, that would be great. And then if you could highlight how stakeholders within the ecosystem of the built environment could be helping mobility companies.
I'll start. So we recently invested in a company that came out of the Elemental Accelerator. Danielle actually made the introduction, called Charger Help. And what they're doing is effectively giving a performance guarantee to EV charging networks. So they are building a platform that will send a distributed workforce of qualified electricians to go and make repairs within 48 hours to EV chargers anywhere in the country. They're starting with kind of the 8 most dense states right now that have a significant EV infrastructure, but the goal is to be nationwide. And it's been really interesting to watch as they've kind of are starting to get early signs of exit velocity. It's still very early days for them. But very, very early days. But it's interesting to see kind of the universe of actors that they have to interface with in order to get a deal signed. So there's network providers, there's hardware manufacturers, there's automobile OEMs, there's fleet people, there's large fleets, there's Fortune 1000 companies with their own chargers, there's real estate. And each one of these customers is, very different in terms of their ability to, sign on the line that is dotted or have any amount of budgetary kind of concerns for the upkeep of their EV charging stations. And they all have different incentives to do so. There's some folks that are more incentivized to put new infrastructure down, and they care less about the quality of service that's rendered. There's some people who are obsessed with service, but they have very little capability to grow the number of chargers in their network. So it's an interesting kind of almost an emerging market that hopefully we can learn from the gasoline and petrol infrastructure woes of the 1940s and do this a lot more efficiently. And the other thing I would say is that the powers that be that kind of command the largest share of this, I think, are the OEMs and the Fortune 1000 companies, these large corporates that, other parts of the mobility industry, care very little or not at all at being a helpful partner to new technologies. And now they're being kind of dragged over the finish line by a number of different forces. So it's interesting to watch a small startup navigate all these things because this is brand new territory in a lot of ways.
All right. Yeah, Chaarvi, you want to go?
Yeah, I was just going to go next. I was just going to say that for us at the AmFam Institute, we haven't yet made a mobility investment, though we have been looking at a lot of companies across the spaces. But I think what sort of really stands out to us as being super important and just really crucial is also some of the themes of this summit is how do startups and entrepreneurs bring together mobility and access and equity? Because I think there are a lot of great innovations coming out in mobility when we think about clean tech, green energy, and also, everyone wants to go into space now, but then how do we bring this down to people who don't have access to easy ways to travel, who don't have access to clean and green infrastructure, and how are startups revolutionizing that? I think is something that has been really interesting to see. That I think there's been a lot of activity in sort of shared transport services, thinking of sort of equity for union and cab drivers has been another interesting one. And the last sort of space where I'm seeing some innovation has been around trucking and clean trucking and drivers over there. But I think more and more as startups build out models in these spaces, it is really important, I think, for at least I think a lot of us on this call, how do they bring in the ideas of equity, access, and opportunity?
On our side, we're thinking a lot about macro issues, considering some of the news that a lot of countries are stopping the sales of diesel trucks. It means that we need to change the infrastructure of how people move and how goods are moved in order to enable like this clean mobility future that we're thinking about. And in order to do that, it's not just new batteries, it's also what does the next generation of the truck stop look like? How do ports operated? How are we thinking about, last mile transit? And all of those things are how we're thinking about mobility, like really, really in a broad way. On top of that, in terms of the heavy duty trucking industry, I think there is a lot of space for innovation there.
And I'll go quickly. I haven't been directly involved in any investments in the mobility space. I can speak a little bit about what Sidewalk Infrastructure Partners has done. We did make an investment in autonomous vehicle infrastructure. We responded to an RFP in Detroit that we won, which was really kind of helping them build out kind of the first autonomous vehicle road, right, on corridor for autonomous vehicles going from, I believe, from the airport to kind of downtown Detroit. And so that one was fascinating to kind of hear about that and kind of how Sidewalk Infrastructure Partners was able to win that RFP prior to me joining. But even for that, we had to be very engaged with the community and understand kind of what the needs are and how to get equitable access. Because that was, at the very forefront of what Detroit was looking for. What Michigan was looking for. Personally, the only mobility investments that I've been involved with have been really kind of around the infrastructure side and thinking about fleet charging, EV fleet charging, which I think is super interesting, particularly as you think about, if we're really going to go from most vehicles going to electric vehicles by 2030, like what is that impact going to be on the grid is something that we think about a lot. Kind of the proliferation of DERs and just that grid congestion that's going to happen because of that. And so how do we, how do you get EVs involved? There is some skepticism if we're ever going to truly get to vehicle to grid kind of backflow of EVs into the grid. But even still, you do have to think about what that heavy congestion will look like once you do have all of those EVs charging around the same time, especially for fleets. And how do you, build software around kind of optimizing around the best times of charging, and how do you potentially offer that to residential customers as well? And how do you think about what does that do at the distribution level? Very often you can't even monitor what's at the distribution level. So we're looking at a number of plays in that space to better control and monitor, or a lot of utilities to better control and monitor what's going on at the utility level, particularly because of what's going on with the EV charging.
All right. One, I just want to note that I'm very competitive, and I want to share that we've gone from 72 viewers to now 96, so we're winning. But you guys kind of danced into the next question, which is, one, we all have a lot of calls with each other as investors when we're always trying to share, what were your thoughts about this investment, or do you think this is a good investment? And I look at it as like we are reading the breadcrumbs into the future to really inform the decisions of the capital, of where we put the capital. And so I thought it would be great if you guys could kind of, let us know what are some of the main things that you guys look into when you're deciding whether or not to make an investment with your team. And if you could highlight specifically what you think about in terms of GovTech technology selling to government.
I think most VCs are scared, and they shouldn't be. I think that there's, what's his face? Mark Andreessen said software is going to eat the world 20 something years ago, and he was right. And I have this unpopular opinion that a lot of the lower hanging fruit of the kind of innovation economy has kind of been sorted or achieved. And specifically for things in climate tech and kind of going forward, we're moving into things that need to be addressed in the world of atoms, not bits, so to speak. And when you get into the physical world, you're going to get into what governs the physical world much more, which includes government. So I just think that, like, if you want to solve these big thorny problems, you need to live in the world that exists right now. And there's plenty of kind of like free market, Peter Thiel kind of people that think government should be an algorithm, and God bless them. But until it is, this, you know, if you want to work in this type of arena, you need to know how to play with the players in the arena, and the government's one of them. It's also one of the largest employers. It's also one of the largest, like, you know, supporters of basic scientific research, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that working with government, understanding how to work with government, having a strategy to work with government as an investor or as a founder is going to be the big differentiator over the next, I would say, 10 years. You know, back when Sun Edison and the solar super majors were having a field day in the mid 2010s, often you would hear the exec team say the most important person in the company is the government affairs person. I think that continues to be true in any regulated industry, whether you're in healthcare, mobility, or infrastructure. And that's just the rules of the game. So play by the rules. Don't you want to be the best? That's my view.
Our firm was actually founded by Pete Deere Davidson, who used to run the loan program office at the Department of Energy. So we are very blessed to have people who really understand how government works. And we're always chasing an opportunity to participate in something that might look like, you know, a private-public partnership, or like thinking about how governmental decisions and policy decisions are going to affect some of the next waves of innovation, because there are some industries that you're going to walk into that are so capital investment heavy that it doesn't make sense to take a position unless we know for sure that, you know, the city X or state X or the federal government stands beside it. And there's going to be a regulation that's going to encourage people to make a big jump that they might not have normally made outside of just the general better, faster, and cheaper. So I think there needs to be a better way for both sides to communicate. I think there have been people who have been holding their breath on this next infrastructure deal that they're calling it. It's an infrastructure deal, but it's really an everything deal, right? There are people who are taking the perspective of participating in the lobbying process and the, you know, regulatory design process, and that's one way. But if there was a cleaner way for people to, you know, sit alongside decision makers and say, the same way that Christian talked about an RFP for the city of Detroit, I think there'd be a lot more investors who'd be less afraid of government tech and not having to wait, you know, 2 or 3 years or for a decision to be made or for the political powers to change and something get erased or eradicated.
Yeah, we you know, we've leaned into it, right? I think, you know, we think a lot about and everything that we touch has some level of government oversight or heavy regulation, even if it's in the energy sector, with dealing with utilities. So we like to lean into it. We like to talk to the experts. We like to understand, you know, how ready is this market? How receptive is government? How receptive are regulators? How receptive are the end customers? And I think that's super important for us. And then we need to understand kind of what is our value add, what is our alpha, what are we going to be able to catalyze and cause the market to move faster. We have to have conviction around that in order for us to move forward with an investment. So, you know, whether it's our ability to kind of show something innovative in an RFP and kind of build out a flagship project that we can build from there, using our connectivity with Google and, you know, Google X and Sidewalk Labs over there, like it just being able to build all of those, bring all of those tools to the table with the pension funds and the capital players and then the various government relationships that we have, and just bring those people around the table and say, look, what type of world are we really trying to build here? What are we willing to commit to in order to move forward?
Yeah, and just to sort of add on, agree with what everyone else has said, and also like when we think about impact and access and scale for a lot of energy utility as well as sort of transportation, the biggest way to reach scale and have the highest impact is to go to government, whether or not we like to admit it. And you know, my hot take is that investors who call themselves impact investors but then refuse to lean into GovTech or sort of call that out as a red flag and refuse to invest in the sector. I'm like, some little bit of suspicion over there. But I do think that for entrepreneurs or startups or founders working with the government, we do see that as being really important, but super hard. But it is sort of how do you build those inroads into the market, into the government? Who do you know, and how are you smartly building the right networks that you need? I think is the biggest thing that we look for, and how we assess how this is going to play out.
Right. Well, I think we got everybody to start asking questions, which I think is great. I'll quickly just say that, yes, that government affairs person that's on the team of a company is essential in my eyes, if it's the GovTech technology. The other piece is just like, and it's a crowded space, specifically like micro mobility. I really want to know how well you play. Do you play nice with government? Because it's really, we've learned from initial disruption days that disruption is only an effective strategy for a short amount of time. And so trying to figure that out. And then those companies that have a community engagement focus, has the bandwidth and capacity to really take that time and work with community, also really win in the space. I want to go to Gretchen's second question, which is, who should be funding or investing in the infrastructure, and specifically data infrastructure?
So we're talking about mobility here, right? Mobility related.
Well, I brought you guys all together as both environments, because I know that we're broad reaching here.
Okay. Yeah, this is such an interesting question, because you're going to fall upon an issue of the tragedy of the commons. And whenever you're in those situations, there's usually two groups that take the lead. One is government, and then part two is like philanthropy or mission-based organizations. And if you rely on mission-based organizations, then you're at the whim of random budgets and people's goodwill. So the only organization that is dedicated to on paper, dedicated to the goodwill of its citizens is the government. I think infrastructure should be built in a way that's modular, that allows for people to participate. I think we've seen some of the challenges of regulated monopolies and how they've worked and not worked so well in some areas. And I think the ways that we used to do things don't need to be the ways that we do things in the future. So for years, and my background is in utilities, you've seen utilities try to kind of like get out of under the reach of these public utilities commissions. And at the same time, they can't survive without the input of the average ratepayer. So you're stuck in a hard place, and all of a sudden you have things like wildfires, et cetera. Now, I'm not saying that the government should own everything, because then you end up having the government as the holder of all the risk, which is what happens anyway. But if you structure these platforms in a good way, there's a way that you can associate the costs of building as well as associate the benefits of participating in these investments, so that we can find a way to equitably build in places where it might not make financial sense for private markets to build, but also share the profits amongst the community. So I think it's one of those questions that if I was building a world from scratch, it's very easy to come up with an answer. Now, if you're trying to build and mend the world that we have already, that have thousands of stakeholders, it's really difficult. I like to believe that all politics is local, and trying to understand like what are some like really small infrastructure builds that have been successful, like maybe local microgrids, or we've seen some really amazing work with indigenous communities and building out either solar or water systems and new transit routes for some of the Navajo community. Like, can we replicate some of the work that they've done in those areas as well?
I also just want to add to your second part, Danielle, on the use of data and how can that be powerful. I think the question was particularly with infrastructure and mobility, but I think there is, there are, as we know, a lot of key trends and uses of data that can come out if collected well. But I think the barrier becomes that, apart from the large privacy and ethics questions that are there, but then also how open are decision makers to using data in making their decisions, and how is that going to be incorporated in the larger scheme of things? Are they proactive about it, or is there a scheme of education and realignment needed? And if it is the latter, then who is doing that becomes a second question, and who is helping them think through how to make better decisions based on data. So there have been a lot of companies, I think, that have been working on these issues, but then the question has been, who is the right person in the governments to work with this data? How do they use it? And then what are even the larger outcomes that come off of this? So definitely an exciting space, but all of these questions remain.
I think I'd only add the concern around cybersecurity is very real across a lot of industries, particularly when there's so many startups and software companies selling infratech type solutions out there, and they're all to some extent susceptible to attacks, right? So if you're selling something to utility, selling something to the government, there's a lot of concern around, how do we protect against any type of hack once you do get imported into our data. And so I'd keep that top of mind. There's a number of cybersecurity startups that are really starting to think about how do we protect some of our core infrastructure and some of the data around that. So it's something that we've been looking into as well and thinking about with all of our projects and any time that we approach the government, but it's increasingly becoming almost like a top priority for a lot of stakeholders.
I want to go to BCP Monitor's question, which is, how do we encourage government to make those riskier investments? And how would you all like to work with government?
So it's interesting. Historically, the government's been doing a lot of the basic scientific research that, whether it's through DARPA or other government funded programs that kind of push the needle on a lot of the stuff, especially material science and other things that are kind of like core, the undergirdings of things like the internet, for example. They've taken a back seat to that in the last couple of decades, and they're letting the SpaceXs of the world kind of like lead the way. So I think the answer is, at this point, if they are abandoning the basic scientific research kind of like lever, which they can't completely, because you need Berkeley Lab, you need Argonne, you need the National Lab System, you need all these things to kind of push things forward. But I think it's a function of understanding the capital stack that's required to build these types of companies and seeing where the government can fit in. Typically, equity is not where they should play. It's debt. It's like first loss guarantees for core types of technologies that we need as a country, or as a constituency. I think that's number one. The fact that we don't have like an internal development bank or infrastructure bank is kind of silly to me. Especially because there's European countries that have that in spades, and even China now. I think that if you put all that in place, you get this institutional lift from the public side that the private side typically, will ride the coattails of. I think in infrastructure, historically, just speaking on one market, government was putting, I believe it's like $600 billion or something into it a year, something like that, and the private markets were between 1.5 to 3x that every investment every year. So it's not that there's no money in it. It's that there needs to be effectively strategic leadership and strategic focus, and the markets aren't the best at doing that for greed reasons. And so if the government says, hey, we want to have high-speed rail all over the country, and the big three need to get in line and do electrify their entire supply chain, now's the time to do that. And we'll see if we get it. We'll see if we get any of this stuff. But I think that that should be where it is. The government is still the collective action, this collective will of the people. And if they can set the focus, we're going to the moon in 10 years, something like that, then everything else will kind of line up behind it. You're seeing it with the infrastructure bill as well. There's so many firms that are watching this with bated breath to see exactly how the money will trickle out and support certain things that, you know, they're betting their investment thesis on. So that's how they should do it. They should be leaders.
I'd follow up to say that I think the part that I love about innovation is that it's about flexibility. And flexibility means adaptability. It also means winning, but also it means failing and learning from failure. So the same loan program office that invested in Tesla also invested in Solyndra and also invested in Fisker, right? So, you know, at the time, all of those decisions were made with sound mind, but Tesla is the star that we see out of it. And the fall of Solyndra had a really negative effect across the markets and led to a lot of people not believing that what we're now calling as climate tech, essentially clean tech, was not investment grade. So, and there are some people who are still nervous about investing in clean tech as a result of the fallout of clean tech 1.0. So when we talk about these, you know, government making larger investments, I think you have to think about it the same way as anyone making an investment. Sometimes there's going to be winners and there's going to be losers, separate from, you know, the fundamental research and the sciences that we have with the fantastic labs and the grants that are there. But also I'd love to see more grant funding for non-hard sciences and non-chemistry based solutions. So as of now, there's a lot of opportunities, whether that's through SBIR, through the National Science Foundation, and some other entities like these labs that have funding for people who are creating like new research and building upon different technologies, but there's less opportunities to get government funding if you have like a software company or if you're building something that's a little bit less sciencey. There's some funding, but not a lot. So if you want to build a services-based company, like it would be amazing if there's more government funding to do something like that, and to like allow for additional funding for the government to essentially, you know, swing for the seats. And if they fail, and we, you know, learn from that and do all the case studies, but don't let that stop us from continuing to invest in the future.
I think we've seen the best traction with anything that's directly government related whenever there's clear mandates, right? So whether it's, you know, this RFP or that's really being pushed by regulators saying that you guys have to hit this goal, and having innovation really baked in there, I think that's usually super important. You know, we would love to continue to do more P3s like the U.S. has done decades ago, and it's been challenging, right? I think a lot of people have got burned in the past by it. It's hard to align stakeholder interest, so you see a lot less of that now. But I still think government has a huge role to play in terms of, again, putting together that clear mandate, putting clear direction, and the private sector will react to that very quickly. And to the extent that you can have some form of capital that's, you know, again, very clear what it's going to do, how it's going to incentivize the market, that's also very helpful, whether it's kind of the first loss piece or, you know, even just being something to help build the foundation for early stage projects or early stage trials or pilots, so that we can, private sector investors can go in and take some risk and, you know, try new innovations.
Yeah, I'll jump in there and say, I think what's most helpful for me is definitely if, you know, a government entity has said what they're interested in exploring or what is the problem that they're trying to solve. I think, you know, we have visionary legislation, right? We want to stop selling combustion engines, right? We want to make sure that all medium and heavy duty vehicles are clean emissions, right? But I think one of the things is, what are you willing to do to get there? And so if government is able to provide kind of what are the guardrails, right? What are the things that you don't want to happen? So, right, at the city, when we were talking about micromobility, we definitely didn't want anyone to die on the street, right? Very clear, very obvious, right? But how much risk were we willing to take? And that was a conversation that we had to really have, because the fear of new technology is often what prevents folks from seeing the opportunity of new technologies. And so we kind of need to do that kind of deep therapy to understand what's stopping us from pulling the trigger and exploring this new possibility. Well, I think something I really want to bring up with you all, as I know many in the audience are thinking, is they're investors. They're just looking for a return. And so one, I wanted you guys to talk about what type of return are you honestly looking for when you're making an investment in the built environment? Because I know that we're all looking for more than a return. We're looking for impact. And then to Ellen's question is, how do we share the profits with community who is often impacted by the types of technologies we invest in?
I mean, with VC, it's typically the fund needs a return at least 3x cash on cash. So if you get $100 million fund, you need to turn that into $300 million over about 10 years. The traditional way of thinking about it is that you're going to write off about 50% of your portfolio, which is highly wasteful in my opinion, but whatever. So you need bigger wins to make up for the risky losses that you end up taking. So the conventional rule of thumb is you need a company to return at least one to return 10x the investments that you've put into it. And so you're shooting for the target that each of your investments has to have that potential. That's the game in VC. It's really meant for software, everybody. So there's different return expectations in other types of funds. PE's got different expectations. Debt funds have different expectations, but that's kind of the main piece. And then I believe the second part of the question was, how do we return the profits? Fastest way I think is employee-owned companies. That's the fastest way in my opinion. The second fastest way is backing leaders that are building these companies that are that have their incentives aligned with the communities that they operate in. That's not a bolt-on for marketing purposes or CSR. That's somebody who, if they grew up in West Oakland, they found a company in West Oakland and they support the community in West Oakland. Is that hard to do? Yes. Is it worthwhile? Absolutely. I think that most people are kind of have had enough of extractive companies running in, doing what they got to do, and then leaving an economic sacrifice zone in their wake. I think most of us are sick of that. So that's just my opinion.
I think, I'd agree with all of that. And another way that we've explored, and you can do this whenever you're actually deploying more capital on the infrastructure side. So we do a combination of investing on the corporate side for the venture returns that Greg spoke about, but then also doing asset deployment, so putting capital on asset deployment. And usually, almost always actually, what we're exploring has some direct intersection with deploying assets in the communities that we care about. So we did investment in Home Connect, and usually just the way their business model was made is like the people who are going to save the most money from these smart plugs and smart thermostats that they put in our homes are, people who have more of an energy burden, right? In terms of their bill, in terms of their budgets, right? So that's important for us. I've done a deal in the past and turning waste into energy, and the project itself was best situated for most polluted communities, right? So be able to turn that into something useful in the biofuels and energy. And the same for kind of, a lot of what we think about energy efficiency and renewable energy. A lot of the community, the business model just happens to be very aligned with the communities that need it most. And that's what we really look for. And so I think that's another way that, it's not, a lot of the economics end up flowing to those communities because you have to provide them savings in order for your company to do well. And that's what we like to see usually.
I once again agree with all of them. I think most of us on the call would identify ourselves as some sort of impact investor. But when I talk about impact investor, like we don't give concessionary returns. Our firm firmly believes that you can do well by doing good. So we're also looking at technologies and that have reached a certain level of commercialization, but just need that help with scaling. So our firm's a little bit different, but since we're focused on scaling, we ask ourselves, like, what are the types of technology that we actually want to scale? What are the unintended consequences of scaling certain types of technology? You know, who are the people who are going to benefit from this? And we take kind of like that ESG metrics and reporting really seriously. For us, one of the things that we've done early in the organization is like really to invest in like rural communities. So we have a number of energy projects that are in rural areas that have not had a lot of utility scale energy or renewables before, and thinking about downstream, like how do we measure impact and are we measuring the right things? When I think about sharing profits, there's like dollars and cents there in terms of like hiring local when possible, but also like, you know, who are the partners that we're choosing, where are the vendors located? And that once again, like Greg said, you don't want to be extractive and leave an economic sacrifice zone, which I'm going to use that for the future behind.
That's full credit to Chris Hedges, who's a fantastic writer who I blatantly stole that from.
And just agree with everything as everyone has said, but just one thing to add is when we think about sharing profits, one thing that was said was finding those leaders who care about these issues. But the second part that we really care about is also how do you nurture these leaders and make sure that you can help them build from the ground up, because they do come from areas, communities that are sometimes don't have access, don't have all of these opportunities that people could find easily. So how do we take some of our profits or set aside some dollars to invest in those communities and programs, build those ecosystems and networks in often just overlooked areas of the country? I think that's been one of the ways that we like to nurture leadership ideas and growth from the ground up, which can be really powerful, hopefully in the long run.
All right. And on Elemental side, I would say we like to ensure that community-based organizations are involved with the deployment of our company's projects. We call it place-based innovation. So we have, mobility justice advocates work alongside our startups and really help them identify those gaps that Chaarvi mentioned, and make sure that, that we're getting kind of the lived experience for them. But a shameless plug is Elemental re-releasing its equity field guide, which is really intended to be kind of that DEI for early stage startups that don't exactly have the bandwidth to onboard a DEI consultant. But it's a really big focus on what we have realized is we can't have equitable outcomes until our founders have really done the work and done the introspective type of approach and understand not everybody is going to be where they are in terms of a starting point. I want to jump into, I hope I'm saying your name right, is Mahul's question. How are you all thinking about planning for cities or smart cities specifically, using data so that our built infrastructure doesn't become obsolete in the future, for example, like parking structures, and stays ever changing and responsive based on people's needs?
That's a great question. It's a big question. I don't know if anyone knows the true answer on what the city of tomorrow is going to look like. I think for the last 10 years, people kind of thought about, I don't know if you've seen Big Hero 6, but it looks a lot like San Francisco. I think with the now kind of burgeoning and increasing uncertainties around climate effects, I think, like flooding in New York, these heat domes and all these other things, I think it's going to be a lot more important to rebuild kind of everything. And while you do that, you can install sensors and Wi-Fi and all these other things, you know, alongside of it, and solar. So it's an opportunity, but I think that there's, if any, personal opinion, again, I'm just one data point, so please just take this with a grain of salt. I don't think anyone knows what it's going to look like. And so I don't know if anyone knows what the priorities are going to be. And I think it's going to be different in different parts of the country. And then globally, obviously, is a complete crapshoot. So to answer your question, I don't know.
And there's so much complexity behind it, right? If you think about what's going on with EV charging, what's going to go on with autonomous vehicles. Malcolm Gladwell actually did a hilarious revisionist history where it's just like, you know, if there's autonomous vehicles all over a dense urban area, pedestrians would just take over, right? Because everybody would, the autonomous vehicles would just stop for all the pedestrians who are just flooding the streets, right? And so, you know, it can look so many different ways. Who knows what parking infrastructure will look like in that type of world, what the grid needs are going to be. We're going to have to rethink probably, you know, a lot of things after we have that level of innovation.
Yeah, and I also think that it's not like one big innovation or one sweeping thesis that anyone can have. It's stacking up of a lot of different areas and a lot of different small innovations together that will build up in what sort of the smart cities or built environment looks like, and becomes a lot of smaller, you know, EV, micromobility, be it parking, be it energy, demand response, and so on. So each of them are different areas in itself that have different levers of needs that, you know, need to be contextualized everywhere we go.
If I could predict the future, I'd be a very rich woman, but I can't. But I will say, of some of the models that have been pitched to me, the ones that I find the most exciting are the ones that are actually thinking about collaboration and how people utilize space. However, we know a lot has changed in the last 16 months, the way that, like, if there was a startup or, you know, an invention that was created for back when everyone used to go into the office, it's now temporarily null and void. So even when we did say we were collaborating and working for the greater good, like, we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow that might change that. I'm very interested in spaces that serve more than one purpose. I think the classic way that you see that is the donut shop that sells donuts in the morning and Chinese food in the afternoon, if you're in California, or the coffee shop that turns into a wine bar. You know, what's the equivalent of that when we're thinking about smart cities? For some folks, it's, you know, things that look like parking structures, but they can also become modular and serve different purposes. I think there's also this piece around emergency preparedness and disaster control that also happens when we're talking about smart cities. So some of those, you know, parking structures all of a sudden becomes safe shelters in the event of something bad happening. So I think in some cities, especially ones where there's a lot of real estate constraints, we're seeing people being really creative with the use of space.
All right. Well, I would definitely say I look at it as we should never be expecting hard infrastructure to move at the rate of digital infrastructure. I think it's just unrealistic. And so figuring out the best way to accommodate both digital infrastructure and hard infrastructure is really what the challenge is of our cities. I think something else is just noting that a lot of infrastructure, like, right, the Army Corps of Engineers does their rating, right? Are we A, B, C, D, E, right? And I think we're definitely more on the D spectrum as a nation. And what is it going to take? And it is going to take a hard investment. And so that is a really big reason why investors are salivating around the American Jobs Plan. I just think in terms of the built environment, my Twitter is Innovation DJ for a reason. It's really the belief that it takes, mixing the old school with the new school is really what's going to get us to the future. This idea that we're just going to rip up everything and make everything anew, it really, I think, is one, unattainable and unrealistic. And I do think there are things to shout out to all my signal timers, right? Like, you can only do so much signal timing, smart signal timing, really. And so I think one that just needs to be highlighted. I do want to really quickly, as our last question, touch on Colin Murphy's question, which is really, he's focusing on micromobility, but I think a big question is, once, venture capital has helped to stand up new innovations, when do you think it makes sense for government to take them on? So it looks like bike share is being absorbed by government, but scooter share still remains as a private service. So any ideas there, folks?
I question the order of operations there. I don't know if I think that there's, again, it's like, also venture capital is not the answer for a lot of this stuff. I think government is the answer for a lot of this stuff. I think that like bike share makes a lot of sense and in every city. And I think that they've proven this out. Scooters have more moving parts and batteries and all sorts of other things that are a huge pain in the butt to work with. So all of that kind of excess hardware and inventory risk being put onto a government would kind of suck for taxpayers, whereas like it's fine for investors to take that type of risk to see if there's a reward at the end of the rainbow. I think on micromobility, I've thought about this a lot. It's different in every city because every city has different mobility patterns. So for example, like I grew up in Chicago. If you're in certain parts of the city, you've got bus access, but it's not anywhere near what you need in order to get to work in less than an hour. If you're working in parts of the Bay Area, you really just need to get to the BART as like, your main artery. Micromobility makes a ton of sense there. So it's more about the use case and the customers or the taxpayers that are like on the hook for this type of thing. And since every city is different and every city has different public transit infrastructure and these things all kind of play together. It's this big complex system. So in some cities, like with high density, yeah, government can go and deploy a very successful bike share that may or may not even pay for itself. So I think that it's not a government steps in after VC takes a risk. Historically, it's been government takes a ton of risk on the technology side, and then as soon as something needs to be commercialized, VC starts taking risk. So I don't think it's the order of operations is wrong in the question, in my opinion.
Did anyone want to add anything in our last 30 seconds? All right. Well, I just want to thank each and every one of you for joining me and having this discussion. I always enjoy having calls with you guys and picking your brains. So I really appreciate you guys taking the time, and shout out to the audience for staying with us. Our retention rate is great, guys. And everyone for all your questions. I'm sorry that we didn't get to them, but you can find all of us on Twitter if you'd like to talk with us. My name is innovation_ on Twitter. Do you guys want to give a shout out to your Twitters really quick?
My Twitter is Nnekapedia, Nnekapedia.
I am social media inept, so you can find me on LinkedIn.
I'm G Bennett 41. I'm usually retweeting onion articles.
And I'm at Chaarvi Badani on Twitter.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danielle and Nneka and Christian and Chaarvi and Greg. That was an amazing conversation. Let me invite our participants to join us for some hallway chatter if they want to. There'll be links on your feed loop platform above or below or somewhere. Meet people, share what struck you. This was just this mind-blowing conversation and really, really excited with what we heard, particularly with the main point that VC is not monolithic, and there's lots of people working in there, bringing in equity issues, and also the whole idea of where does government really play, and how can it be really effective. I hope we can swing around from that, oh, we shied away from Solyndra and that was a failure, we'll never do that again, because there's a lot of things we need to invest in. Thank you so much.